Hi, Bruce.
How are you, Will?
Very well. How are you today?
Doing pretty well.
That's good. Thanks for coming on Free Will. I'm Will Wilkinson here at the Cato Institute. I have with me Bruce Caldwell, who's a professor at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. That's correct?
I was a professor.
Oh,
there.
you were, but you've moved on.
That's right.
Where are you now?
On July 1st, so just over a week ago, I started my appointment as a research professor at Duke University.
Oh, well, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, I wasn't aware of that. Well, Bruce Caldwell, professor at Duke, and author of Hayek's Challenge, an intellectual biography of F.A. Hayek. And when did Hayek's Challenge come out, Bruce?
2004, I think.
Yeah, and I think it is safe to say it's the sort of most exhaustive account of the content and development of Hayek's ideas.
Well, it focuses. It certainly is an intellectual biography, but it actually focuses on, to a great extent, on his methodological views and the evolution of his methodological views within the context of his being part of the Austrian School of Economics. So it is not. It's not a full intellectual biography in the way that where the pure theory of capital gets treated and all of his work on monetary theory gets treated in the same sort of depth that certain other issues do. So just truth in advertising in terms of the nature of the book.
Well, as a sort of philosophy geek with an interest in economics, it's all the stuff that I'm kind of interested in.
It's all the stuff I was interested in, too.
Yeah. So I love all these methodological disputes, whereas others find them sort of inaccessible, but I love it.
Well, I try to make them as accessible as they can be made, and I think I did a pretty good job on that part, actually, because it's the stuff I really love, and it's the stuff I wanted people to know about.
So is Hayek your sort of chief focus in your scholarship?
Actually, I started out, I'm an historian of economic thought, okay? And my initial interest was the methodology of economics in the sense that I loved economics as an undergraduate. When I got to grad school, it was taught in a very different way, and I wanted to try to figure out why economics looked the way it did in grad school. And I studied the philosophy of science, which is trying to, it's a field that tries to say why sciences look the way they do, how they should be practiced. And I came up with some rather disquieting results. Basically, economists had borrowed from positivist philosophy of science when they were talking about economics, and positivist philosophy of science was pretty much dead in the 70s when I was looking at these issues. So basically, when we talked about why we did economics the way we did, we were accessing a defunct philosophy of science, and we actually had borrowed fairly badly from it when we did use it. So I wasn't really much closer than I was when I started my dissertation in figuring out why economics looks the way it did. So then I just started looking at alternative approaches to economics, and I stumbled on the Austrians, and Hayek seemed to actually he said a lot of things that made a lot of sense about why economics faced certain limitations in its ability to predict, the sorts of explanations that are possible when you're dealing with social phenomena. He made sense of the problems that I encountered in a way that the formal philosophy of science that I first accessed did not.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about Hayek's history and his milieu, because he comes out of a time and place which is, in fact, the origin of sort of logical empiricism or logical positivism, as people heard of it. So, and actually, that's one of my sort of favorite tangential topics is why certain places at certain times create such efflorescences of intellectual creativity. And Vienna, at the beginning of the 20th century, is one of those places. So can you tell us a little bit about Hayek's sort of education and early career, and maybe something about the trajectory of his career overall, and then we can drill down into some of his ideas.
Okay, sure. Well, he was born in Vienna in 1899. educated through high school, wasn't a particularly good high school student because he was often bored, fought in World War I, and then entered the university at the end of World War I. And he has this wonderful knack of running into people who are later going to be famous throughout his career. So when he was a student in the university, he was, for example, classmates with Oscar Morgenstern, who was one of the inventors with John von Neumann of game theory. Fritz Machlup, Gottfried Haberler were also classmates. He wanted to go to the United States after he graduated, so he got letters of introduction from Joseph Schumpeter, wrote him letters of introduction, and while he was there, he sat in on a wonderful class taught by the leading American institutionalist Wesley Clair Mitchell. So by the time he was in his early 20s, he had really met some extremely important economists. He came back and sat in on Ludwig von Mises's seminar, and his initial work in economics was in monetary theory and theory of the trade cycle, which were the areas that von Mises was also quite interested in. He went to the London School of Economics in the 1930s. As soon as he hit the ground there, he engaged in a long debate with John Maynard Keynes about theory of the business cycle and their respective monetary theories. While also in the 30s, he engaged in a socialist calculation debate with leading socialists in Britain, capital theory debates with Frank Knight, who was at that time probably the most famous American economist. During the war, he wrote his perhaps most famous book, The Road to Serfdom, and after the war moved to the University of Chicago. And some people say that his move was actually responsible for the formation of the Chicago School of Economics, because he was instrumental in putting together the money for bringing Aaron Director to Chicago. And Director was really a key figure in terms of the formation of the school. So he was at Chicago when the Chicago School of Economics was being formed. He helped bring Karl Popper to the London School of Economics. While he was at Chicago, he started to work on political theory more than economics, and Constitution of Liberty and Law Legislation and Liberty, his two big books in those areas, came out in the first in 1960 and the other as a trilogy during the 1970s. And he lived till 1992. He actually lived to see the collapse of the East Bloc. His last book, The Fatal Conceit, was published in 1988. So he actually was writing from the early 20s through 1988. So he had a wonderful career. Actually, as an historian of thought, he's a fascinating figure because his life spans the 20th century. He always was engaged in debates with other economists. Most of the time people thought he was just dead wrong about everything he was writing. There was only a small group that tended to see him as important. Yet by the time he died, there's an article in the New Yorker in 2000 that went so far. This is in the New Yorker. Went so far as to say that the 20th century will be known as the Hayek century, which was rather incredible, I think.
Yeah, well, thanks. That's an amazingly succinct and informative whirlwind tour, Bruce.
Well, sure. I'm used to doing these.
Well, one of the reasons why I really wanted to have you on is Hayek is one of my favorite thinkers, and I do think he was one of the, if not the most, sort of profound thinker about society in the 20th century. His work is just so incredibly rich and so pregnant with sort of unexplored possibilities. One of the things that I like about thinkers is people who are so creative that they don't even follow up all their own leads.
Well, that's for sure.
And Hayek is full of those things. You read, and he's so broad. So it's not just that Hayek wrote about the business cycle or about monetary theory. He wrote about those things. He wrote about the methodology of the social sciences. He wrote about the nature of the mind. He wrote about the structure of society, how rules and norms evolve and change over time. What explains why some cultures persist and I mean, he just has like this whole range of gigantic questions that he tackles with an incredible incredibly broad and learned set of intellectual tools, and so even if you disagree with particular things that Hayek says, reading him on any topic is almost always enriching.
Yeah, it's rather daunting actually to try to follow his trajectory, just because it takes you into areas inevitably that are not your major areas of specialization. But that indeed, that's one of the reasons why I've always found him exciting, because he's always pushing you beyond any normal boundaries. And you're exactly right. I mean, I think he has actually attracted people who would disagree completely with his politics, but understand that, in fact, he was a rather rich thinker. I mean, social theorists don't normally have the kind of scope that he has, and indeed, a lot of people who as a result, a lot of people are attracted to him. So, right.
And I find that, so he's one of my sort of intellectual lodestars, and other people that I look to, I'll ask them, who should I read?
Right.
And they'll tell me to read Hayek. So
well, good for them.
Yeah. So like Vernon Smith, the experimental economist. I was like, Vernon, who should I read? Well, Hayek.
Yes, Vernon likes Hayek quite a bit.
And he does. And a guy with very different politics from Hayek, Douglas North, one of the leading institutional economists. Right. I had a chance of working with him for some time.
Great.
And he's like, it's all there. It's all there in Hayek.
Well, I mean, both of them were attracted. I mean, Doug, I think, was attracted to him because of Hayek's insistence that a market has to be embedded in a set of other social institutions to work.
Yep.
And Hayek was saying that back in the 50s and 60s, when economists were going on their merry way, ignoring existing institutions on the ground in their various policy pronouncements about how to make the less developed world more developed, and ignoring all of the institutions that are quite important in that context. And Vernon has a wonderful paper on the knowledge problem in Hayek and experimental economics, and just pointing out that Hayek was talking about how markets are able to coordinate people who have dispersed knowledge, who have different knowledge from each other, and yet bring them together as if you get results that in a model would require full information on the part of all the participants. So, yes, you've identified those two Nobelists actually have a great appreciation of Hayek. Exactly right.
Also, James Buchanan, who's a big hero of mine, has done a lot of work on sort of extending some of Hayek's thoughts.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think by other Nobel Prize winners will tell you that Hayek is the person they go to when they're looking for sort of profound insights.
Right.
And I think that's really significant. That's something people ought to, well, especially in light of comments like this. I mentioned to you just beforehand, I had a blog post today where I noted a book review by Alan Wolf in the New Republic, where he labels Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek as marginal and somewhat bizarre thinkers. Which is just, I think, a little bit, I mean, to some extent...
they're a little bizarre, perhaps.
They're a little bit bizarre.
Marginal, I think, is going a little too far.
Yeah, I mean...
Marginalist, perhaps.
Marginalist, they're both marginalists, for sure. But I think a greater appreciation of Hayek would help people just think more clearly about the way a society and an economy work. So let's get
well, let me just add a little something to that. Mm-hmm. If people want to counter Alan Wolf's view, they should read Virginia Pastrell's wonderful article in the Boston Globe. And if you go to my website, you'll be able to find the connection, the link to it. But her article is Friedrich Hayek, the most important 20th century social theorist about whom you've never heard. So I mean, I think someone who says he's a marginal thinker is probably in that group that just doesn't know that much about Hayek, and he is someone that a lot of people don't know about. So Virginia's article is great, actually.
Well, we can put a link to that on the side of our screen here.
Super.
So we'll put that up. So let's talk about some of Hayek's most important ideas. One of the things that he's most strongly identified with is the notion of a spontaneous order.
Sure.
The idea that you can have sort of ordered systems that are not planned, not supervised, that are the sort of unintended consequences of human action. Could you say a little bit about where his ideas about and his overall, he has a larger view of the social sciences, that the chief explanandum of social science is to try to grasp and explain how it is that these orders emerge and remain stable over time.
Right.
Which is a radically different view of what social science is supposed to be a science of relative to the mainstream of thinking in the 20th century.
Right. Well, one reason, in my book, I start with the earlier Austrian economists, Karl Menger, and then trace through and talk about the various debates that the Austrians had with the German historical school economists initially, and then also with socialists and positivists in Vienna. So if we go back to Menger provides a wonderful example of social phenomena that it is due to human intent, but not to human design. Okay, so money is the example. Where did money come from? Money is obviously something that is essential for the development of an economy. Money allows people to overcome the problem of barter. If I like to drink scotch and you make scotch, and I make chairs and I bring you chairs to trade for the scotch, well, you get sick of having my chairs, so then you tell me you want some running shoes, so I have to find somebody who supplies running shoes who wants my chairs in order to get the scotch that I want. This is tremendously inefficient. Money allows us to get around that because we just simply exchange goods for money, something that is accepted and exchanged by everyone. So where did money come from? Did someone invent it? And Menger's idea was, well, no, actually, if we think about it and it's a bit of a just so story, but he's trying to logically figure out where money would come from. And he said, basically, the bright idea that some people have is that they'll trade their running shoes or chairs for, say, bolts of cloth, something that would be that everyone would use because everyone was making their own clothes, for example, in that society. And the most commonly traded good ends up being the money of the society. So that would be how no one set out to create money, but it's something that people trying to make themselves better off ended up creating something that allows society to be better coordinated. Lots of other examples outside of economics. Language is a standard example of something that no one invented, but everyone uses. I mean, the common law is sometimes described as something that is emerging through time based on precedent. No one is trying to form the law. It's something that emerges case by case through time. So these are the sorts of phenomena that Hayek was interested in, and of course it went exactly against the major ideas of particularly in the 1930s and 40s when he was forming these issues. The general idea was that capitalism had collapsed. We wanted to avoid the extremes of totalitarian systems of the left and right, communism or fascism. And for most intellectuals, the obvious answer was, well, what we need is socialist planning. Socialism will allow us to achieve social justice. It will overcome the inadequacies of a market system, which had apparently collapsed during the Great Depression, and we would be able to use our resources wisely for the social good. And Hayek was saying, well, this is based on a vision of what is possible that he said for various reasons didn't think that this could be achieved, but he was also countering it by saying there's a lot of social phenomena that grow up naturally through these spontaneous orders that we're discounting. And indeed our attempt to try to plan society, he felt would run into unintended consequences of its own that were quite negative.
So there's kind of two different sides of the critique. One is that there are these spontaneous orders that you're neglecting. Look at all of these things that sort of coordinate people's behavior, that are orderly, that make people better off, that no planner designed, no one's administering, no one's overseeing. So don't neglect that. The other side of the equation then is, now, when you want to do this planning, you're going to have to gather a lot of information about a lot of different people. You have to know what people want. You're going to have to know, just a lot. And and Hayek was part of a debate about whether or not it would ever be possible for a rational planner to have the information that they would need and to be able to use it in a way that would be even as good as the sort of unplanned order that those types were criticizing.
Right. Well, let me flesh that out just a little bit more. The socialist calculation debate is actually a fascinating episode, and it started with von Mises. There was a German language socialist calculation debate that took place right after World War I. And if you define that, and Mises was arguing that socialism is going to be inefficient. Many socialists were saying it's going to be a lot more efficient than capitalism. Capitalism has business cycles, all the rest. And here was von Mises's argument. He said, well, think about what socialism is. Socialism is where the state or public ownership of the means of production. Okay, so factories, raw materials, the things that are used to make goods, are all owned by the state. Well, if they're all owned by the state, there's no prices attached to the various factors of production.
Right.
And people won't know what would be an efficient use of resources versus an inefficient use of resources. Prices reflect relative scarcities. This is the basic Econ 101 view of what prices do. And without prices attached to them, Roger Garrison had a very homely example of, let's say you're building a shed for your firewood for the winter. What should you use? Well, you look at the prices of the various materials. Why don't people use gold? Why don't they use plutonium? Why don't they use steel? Why do they use other sorts of things? Why do they sometimes just get a piece of plastic and throw it over the wood? It's because of the relative prices of the factors of production that you're using to produce a shed. Well, multiply that by 1 billion in terms of the sorts of decisions that have to be made in something so complex as an economy, and without those prices, the inefficiencies of a centrally planned system are evident, and that's in theory. And then, of course, we have examples that bear out that theory quite well, quite obviously. So that was the beginning of the debate. Now, the socialists didn't sit back and just take this, and in the 30s, an English language socialist calculation debate took place in Britain when Hayek got there. And the socialists came up with two counter-arguments. One was based on general equilibrium theory. This was an approach to economics that portrayed the economy as a vast system of equations. And the argument was, theoretically, if you were in a socialist system, these equations would be solved by socialist managers. If you were in a market system, they're solved by engineers. They are the same sort of systems, so they should. We can represent either system with the same set of equations, so it doesn't really matter who's doing the solving.
Right.
So that was one argument. Another argument, which was,
and that argument requires a huge amount of abstraction away from sort of gritty institutional facts.
Right, exactly. And frankly, it was a fairly easy argument to meet. The much more persuasive one was proposed by Oscar Lange, who said, well, wait a second, we can, and he was called a market socialist because he was in a sense acknowledging the usefulness of markets but trying to adapt it to a socialist system. So he said, well, why don't we do this? We'll just set up a whole bunch of markets and we'll choose these prices for factors of production arbitrarily, and then if we have excess supplies or excess demands, we'll just raise and lower prices. And that will allow us to mimic a market. Now, this seems quite persuasive.
Yeah.
And the response, this is in the context in which Hayek developed his insights about knowledge and dispersed knowledge. So he said, well, if we think about what an economy is, what you've got are literally millions of people who are making decisions every day about what to buy and what to sell. And how do they make these decisions? Well, they look at this vast array of prices. Okay, so the prices help them make decisions, but they also look at their own local knowledge of the man in the street, the man on the spot. Some of this knowledge is tacit knowledge. They wouldn't, the person wouldn't be able to say why, after 20 years in this particular industry, he's making this or she's making that kind of decision about what to buy and sell under these specific market conditions. But
after you've made a grapefruit salad for 20 years for your kids, you know what a good grapefruit looks like.
You start to know.
Yeah, and
if you don't, you're not in business anymore, which is the other part of it.
Yeah, and if the grapefruits just start feeling a little squishy, you buy a few less. That's going to affect the price. But the reason that judgment that you're making that's affecting your demand is something pretty deeply internalized and habituated.
That's right, and you may not be able. You may be able to say, well, this isn't a good grapefruit, but of the vast number of sorts of decisions that people make in markets all the time, sometimes it's just, I've got a sense that this is the way this market was back in '97, and these sorts of things happen. So maybe I'll cut back a little bit on production this year, or maybe I'll increase a little bit. So each one of these decisions, in its turn, feeds into this vast array of prices that is the market system. So prices are both behavior-inducing. They affect people's behavior, but people's behavior create the array of prices. So it's in this sense that this price system contains a huge amount of information. And this information is dispersed, and it's important to know that it's always dispersed. You never get rid of the dispersed. It's not like you move to an equilibrium where everything just settles. It's a world of constant change and variation. People are constantly adjusting. So this is what Hayek called a market process. And this is when he started to move, and the Austrians in general were moving away from equilibrium as the metaphor by which to describe market processes.
Bruce, can you explain really briefly, because it took me forever, strangely enough, to grasp what an equilibrium is supposed to be when economists talk about it. Just say real briefly what it means for a market to be in equilibrium.
Well, if you have had Econ 101 and can think of demand and supply diagrams, it's where they intersect. So the idea behind equilibrium is once you're there, if nothing else in the system changes, you'll stay there. And if something does change and it's a stable equilibrium, you'll return to it. And typically, we assume stable equilibria for things like demand and supply diagrams. So the notion of an equilibrium is...
And so what would that mean then for a big economy?
Well, this was the thing. The general equilibrium theory that Hayek, ironically, Hayek and Lionel Robbins, his friend at the London School of Economics, wanted to bring continental thought to Britain. So they were instrumental in bringing Walrasian and Pareto. Vilfredo Pareto was an Italian economist who was Walras' successor in the general equilibrium theory in the Lausanne School. So anyway, these ideas were that everyone has perfect information, and this system of equations gets solved, and you're in general equilibrium, that all markets in the economy are in equilibrium. And this is a theoretical model, a way of representing the economy. It's not meant to be institutionally rich, but it's meant to shed some light on the interconnection of markets. Hayek always thought general equilibrium theory was quite good at emphasizing that important point, that all markets are interdependent. But when it comes to describing the process by which markets work, he felt it was inadequate.
Well, one because some of those assumptions aren't true. So there isn't full information.
Right.
So people act in a condition of ignorance. So everybody doesn't know what everybody else wants.
Right.
Everybody doesn't know what the prices are everywhere else.
Right. And everyone has little bits of information that other people don't have.
Right. And so you get dispersion as well.
Exactly.
And so then the question becomes, how are you going to get all of these dispersed bits of partial information coordinated in a way that's going to allow everybody to make, sort of relatively optimal decisions?
Relatively optimal is important, because you're never going to get the perfect kind of coordination that you get in these theoretical models either, in these general equilibrium models. But what you're trying to do is get that institutional mix that allows people to make the best use of their information and get this transmitted to other people. So I always think of when we're inevitably you have people who will contest Hayek's views, obviously, and sometimes it's important to make sure the debate stays along the lines of institutional setups and comparative institutional setups. That's the best way to compare systems. You don't want to compare a pristine theoretical system with the messy world. Mm-hmm. And I think on those grounds, he has quite a defensible case.
Yeah. So I know that there's some dispute over who won that debate.
Well, of course there was a dispute because
I mean, even now, there doesn't seem to be agreement about over whether Hayek or Lange actually had the better of the debate. And I think it probably matters. Depends on how you want to judge it.
Right.
Whether you want to judge it on terms of the mathematical model or on sort of a more substantive set of ideas.
For a long time, the consensus in the economics profession was set by a paper by Abram Bergson, which basically said that theoretically both systems are possible, that Lange had come up with an approach that seemed feasible empirically to work. So it was an empirical question, and all we needed to do was just give it some time and see what happened. So it was judged as a draw by a lot of economists, or simply, we have different systems in place. Let's see how they work. So on those grounds, I mean, I think that certainly, if we take the most raw sort of metric, which would be look at a centrally planned system versus a market system. Centrally planned systems have not done very well. Mm-hmm. Now, most people would say, well, okay, what we want to do is look at something a little less extreme than a centrally planned system, and then you get into the nitty-gritty details of specific systems. And the only way to answer that kind of question is to look at the specific systems in question.
I've even heard people say that the problem was simply that they didn't have good enough computers.
Of course. Now that is always going to be a
maybe if we could just if we knew how to gather data fast enough and get into computers fast enough, then we could calculate all the general equilibrium equations, know what prices to set on all the goods, all the markets are going to clear, everybody's going to get, there's going to be an efficient allocation. We just got to have better computers. But Hayek still implies that couldn't possibly work.
Well, Oscar Lange said this in 1967. Okay, he said if I were answering Hayek now, it would be easy. I'd just say put it all in a supercomputer and we'd have our answer in a minute. Okay, so that was in '67. This is now 2008. The Soviet Union didn't collapse until 1990s, 89 and 1990. So there must be something that is keeping it from happening. Now, I actually think that Hayek's critique alone is pretty strong, but I think what you also need to do is connect it up with the public choice critiques. You mentioned Jim Buchanan, and the difficulty in getting the political system to, in fact, make decisions that economically would make sense. And this is one of the reasons that the East Bloc collapsed. I mean, if you think about Poland and the worker strikes when they tried to raise the price of food. They kept prices artificially low in the communist countries because people don't like high prices. But, of course, that leads to vast shortages. So when you try to rationalize the system by the government raising the price, well, everyone, you always blame markets when prices go up. Oh, it's some evil corporation. But when you actually have a socialist system where the government is, in fact, responsible for the one who's raising the prices, people protest government activities, and this is what this is what got the solidarity movement going, but the Lens and all the rest. Yeah,
I mean, I actually think that's there's kind of two different sets of incentive critiques that I think are more powerful than the knowledge critique. Right. I think altogether they're just completely undefeatable. So one is just the sort of the incentive for basic worker productivity.
Yes.
So if ownership isn't guaranteed, people have a very low incentive to supply their labor, and so the productivity of the economy is going to be very, very low. So what you have to do to sort of optimally redistribute is going to be in much shorter supply than had you sort of kept private ownership. Secondarily, then there's this incentive problem having to do with the administrators,
right?
So you have to assume kind of benevolent administrators whose interest simply is to solve this equation and to optimally distribute the goods of the economy. But that just flies in the face of what you know about human nature and what happens when people get unequal political power. So you take that, you add the calculation debate, and it does an excellent job altogether of explaining why, say, the Soviet Union was such a mess, and why the reason that the economy worked at all was basically because they had fairly well-functioning black markets.
Right, exactly. Well, I'm showing my Hayekian tendencies because I ignored the incentive argument, the first one that you mentioned, because Hayek and the Austrians tended not to. They tended to give that. They said even if you had, under socialism, you're going to have a new socialist economic man, which is what the claim was, so that people were going to work hard even if they didn't own things. And so Hayek and Mises were trying to say, well, even if we grant that, just for the sake of argument, you're still going to have problems. So they tended not to hammer on the incentive thing, which of course became much more important to the economics of information, questions of moral hazard, adverse selection, all that kind of, that literature developed and incentives loomed large. So I think, people say, well, Hayek's argument's incomplete, and I think if you're trying to get the full Monty, as you just laid it out. It's also another reason why I say, in my view, you always want to. You shouldn't just be a Hayekian. You should join the various arguments that have been made by these various people who are within this kind of larger stream of the Chicago school, public choice school, the Austrian school. If you're looking for sets of arguments, just focusing on one is probably not as good an idea as kind of picking and choosing.
Yeah, let's talk a little. I mean, I know to some people this kind of debate seems a little bit antique, but it helps explain what Hayek was up to. So, I mean, and I think it really bears emphasizing, and I think people do lose track of this, partly because Hayek, to such a great extent, ended up winning the debate.
I want to interrupt you there because antique in the sense of central planning.
Yeah.
But if you look at many of the proposals that are on these various candidates' web pages, and look at the amount of information that would be required to do what they want to do efficiently, to actually have the results that they think they will have, and also think about the public choice sorts of questions about the incentives of not only the administration. That's handling the administration of whatever the particular program is, but also some of the incentives of what corporations might be drawn in and do as a result. So, I mean, it's these issues are still quite alive.
Yeah, absolutely. But I wanted to get to. The thing that I wanted to emphasize is that because partly because it seems distant, is the extent to which you were considered completely backwards. Scientifically, like as a social scientist, you're completely backwards if you weren't in favor of some kind of centralization in planning. So that at a particular point in the 20th century, it was kind of like being an intelligent design guy or a global warming denialist to have views like Hayek's, that this was the gold standard of being a real progressive, forward-thinking intellectual, was to believe that we were going to use scientific methods to gather the information we needed and plan a more optimal economy that would make people live longer, be healthier, be happier, and so on and so forth. And the idea that this wouldn't work was just considered a kind of obstructionism that you just had to be sort of malignly motivated to want to stand in the way of a project that was meant to maximize human well-being.
Yeah. The book that Hayek did, The Road to Serfdom, which was his big critique of planning and scientific planning as the panacea for all of society's ills, actually had a rather interesting reception in Britain, where he was better known and had served on the faculty of the LSE, and he knew most of the socialists because he in fact was teaching at the same institution that they were. It was actually respectfully, by and large, received, at least among academics because they said, okay, he's raising interesting issues, and labor was in control after the war, and they needed to think about these issues. Now, it was quite a different case in the United States. There, on the one hand, people who hated the New Deal loved The Road to Serfdom. So it came out as a Reader's Digest. A condensation came out in Reader's Digest that got a huge circulation, something like 8 or 9 million. Book of the Month Club had its own particular offering of about another million. On the other hand, people who disliked it just excoriated Hayek. Herman Feiner's book, The Road to Reaction, was published in 1945, and it was a really intense and almost personal attack on Hayek's views. Really something to be read now. You're exactly right, though, that the general tenor of belief was that science could be used to create a better society in every sense of the word better, and that it was our obligation to do so. And he was, in arguing against socialism, in some ways he was being, people could accept that to seem to argue against science, which he wasn't. He was a scientist. Right. He just felt that, he called it scientism, the idea that you could try to control social phenomena in the way that engineers build a bridge that he thought was wrong.
Yeah, so that and that's the thing that I think still stands today. Why people have so much to gain from a deeper understanding of Hayek. Yes. And the thing that frustrates me, sort of doing public commentary about the economy, is that I really do consider it a kind of fundamental scientific literacy to understand the coordinating function of prices, to understand the limits to the gathering of information, right. To understand the sort of principal agent problems that you get into with political representatives and their and constituents. And there's a whole set of questions to understand sort of Mansur Olson's ideas about dispersed costs and concentrated benefits. Right. There's a whole set of ideas that I think you need to be minimally literate when thinking about public policy. But to some degree, you're still considered a bit reactionary if you even reference Hayek. Like, he was a right winger.
Absolutely.
But that's the thing. Like, one of the things that just annoys me is that I tend to feel, of course, I'm biased, as we all are, but I tend to feel in a lot of these debates that I'm actually standing on the scientific higher ground, grasping stuff that I think is very profound, and it's just known. It's just like it's just known. It's discovered. It's confirmed. Yet people who deny this whole sort of body of sort of constitutional political economy, all this body of knowledge about price systems and so on and so forth, are not considered to be the same kinds of people as people who just deny climate science or something like that.
Yeah. Well,
that was a bit of a rant.
That's okay. Mm-hmm. Ranting's okay. I mean, this is a blog. But did you study economics as an undergraduate?
I studied art as an undergraduate, okay. But I studied political philosophy in graduate school.
Well, often an economics class, and what I mean by that is the intro classes. You go higher up and you start to lose some of the insights. But often a well-taught intro class will get at a lot of those issues, but they won't call them by those names necessarily. It doesn't quite get at the coordination function of prices in the way that Hayek does, but certainly some of the things, if you do a case study look at agricultural price supports or rent controls or things like that, and you say, why are these policies persisting? That whole notion of dispersed costs and concentrated benefits does a lot of work at explaining a lot of bad government programs that are out there. There's a wonderful book called In the Company of Strangers by Paul Seabright, where he talks on exactly the sorts of themes that Hayek was talking about. How is it that we went from hunter-gatherers, 50,000 years ago, to the complex society where I can buy something from across the world and expect it to be delivered in a week, and not have that a remarkable thing at all. So how is it, and particularly given what Seawright said, is that our basic genetic makeup and predisposition is that we're shy, murderous apes. We don't cooperate well, and we're capable of murder. So how is this vast social cooperation? How did it emerge? And he comes up with much the same sort of story that Hayek does in Law, Legislation, and Liberty, the epilogue, or parts of The Fatal Conceit. But he never mentions Hayek, and this book is wildly popular, and he's getting at many of the same issues.
Yeah.
But, when Hayek talks about it, it's this must be his way of saying that the market's always right, or something.
Yeah, well, that's actually one of the issues that fascinates me the most, which I picked up from talking to people like Vernon Smith and Doug Norris, how it is that people, maybe we can talk about what Hayek's ideas were here, how it is that we made this transition from sort of personal to impersonal exchange, how we went from these small tribal bands to this giant extended order of cooperation that extends, thousands of miles, covers billions of people, and seems to be distinctly unnatural.
It is. I mean, and Hayek put it that one of the nice things that he did in his later work was to say, well, people hate the market. I mean, he recognized this, and he says, why is it that people hate their market? He says the market depends on us, on certain conventions or moral stances that go against our instinct, and by that he meant, the shy murderous ape that travels in small groups. You only trust people within your group. Social solidarity, family-like tightness. And it also offends our reason, because our reason thinks that we should be able to plan society and make society work in ways that are straightforwardly rational and better and more efficient. And the market is something that just, market and the sorts of moral beliefs, what Deirdre McCloskey recently has taken to call them the bourgeois virtues, honesty in dealings with strangers, keeping of promises, these sorts of things, that accompany trade. The growth of trade isn't possible without these sorts of moral virtues that are quite different from the sorts that you have in hundreds of thousands of years of human history as the basic predisposition. So it is fascinating. How did we get here? And Hayek, he was on the right. He asked all the right questions. He was on the right trail. He didn't have much confidence in sociobiology. He talked a little bit about group selection, but he recognized the problems that it had in biology, but said, well, cultural evolution is different from biological evolution, so maybe we can make use of this. Not maybe. He thought that we could, in trying to explain how we got to where we are. But that certainly is another one of the. He always managed to ask the right questions and gave very pregnant hints at how we might go about answering.
Yeah. So his work is replete with suggestions about the sort of coevolution of culture and economic structure.
That's right.
Right. It's not really explicitly articulated and laid out.
Right.
But I find it incredibly fascinating. And Hayek, maybe you could say something. He not only has these views about sort of the evolution of culture and norms. He's got a sort of somewhat group selectionist view about the way certain sets of rules are selected and persist over time, which is just basically that the rules that allow groups to do better than all other groups.
That's right.
Last over time, and that's actually there's a lot to be said for that.
Right.
But there's a deeper question then within that question about how it is that there is going to be so much cultural variation, right? So selection only works over variation,
right.
And in order to have variation so he thinks people operate according to certain kinds of tacit rules.
Right.
The rules that they act upon are going to determine the patterns of behavior that emerge in their little societies.
Right.
Those patterns determine basically their standard of living and
right.
so on and so forth. So what explains the way people are able to, in different times and places, able to sort of internalize and habituate to different rules and norms. And again, stuff that doesn't connect up completely, but he's got a fascinating sort of theory of mind that actually that implies that development is going to be extremely ecologically sensitive. Right. That how people develop is going to be very attuned towards their very particular local environment, and that that sort of cultural mimesis and transmission is going to be part of that, and that people will be reacting and sort of developing conceptual categories and norms of behavior that are going to be fitted to the incentives that they encounter in their particular environments. And there's so much that's rich there. It partly explains how it is that we could have cultural evolution at all, how we could have the kind of extended order that we have at all. It also helps explain why we're not, why we don't feel completely alienated. Right? So you need an account of our cultural malleability in order to account for the fact that people aren't completely miserable in something that's so different from their, from the environment of their original adaptation.
Right. Well, I mean, you're getting at a lot of different things there, Will. Yeah. I certainly.
I know. Again, that was just a free association, but I think that
let me pick up on
comes up.
Yeah, let me pick up on one thing. One of the things that I really like. You mentioned his theory of the mind. And, The Sensory Order is one of the books that Hayek wrote right after World War II. He was working on it, published in 1952. And it took me years to figure out what was going on there. But certainly one of the beautiful insights of that book, again, and this is when he really started to get into seeing spontaneous orders in lots of different places, was just, I mean, if we think about what the mind is and our phenomenal experience, the sensory order is what he called it, what we sense, what we pick up. We know that this thing that we are experiencing is in fact the product of billions of neuronal connections in our skull. And yet these individual teeny weeny billions of them happening connections is what gives rise to consciousness. I mean, if there could be a more impressive example of how individual acts create some sort of larger order, I can't think of it. I mean, because we still can't explain, obviously, how it happens. But I mean, it does happen. You know, just hierarchies of interactions and interactions upon interactions and layered in various hierarchies. And what also strikes me as wonderful, and again, part of the reason I'm fascinated by Hayek, is that he was coming up with his stuff on his own. Basically, he had dissected a bunch of brains back in the 1920s, and then had a little student essay, and then put it away in a drawer, pulled it out in 45, and starts working on it, and publishes this thing in 52. It's never referenced, but 40 years later, a lot of neuronal research and philosophy of mind, connectionist approaches in philosophy of mind, are drawing on much this same sort of idea. And people who do find out about Hayek, like Edelman, the Nobel Prize winner, just find it remarkable that he was coming up with these ideas way back when. Yeah,
my background, before I did political philosophy, I was doing philosophy of mind and language.
Oh, okay, great.
And it really
What was your experience then? Did you hear of Hayek when you were doing this?
I actually, I mean, somebody told me that I was already a sort of a libertarian who was into Hayek.
Right.
But somebody mentioned when I was I said, I'm doing philosophy of mind and language, and I was like, well, you should read Hayek's book on the mind. And I was like, oh, I didn't know there was one. And I read
Right.
it, and I mean, and some of it's a little hard to follow.
Oh, yeah.
But it really is incredibly remarkable in the way it really does anticipate a lot of connectionist philosophy of mind,
Right.
which was sort of like one of the main streams in the philosophy of mind. There's like connectionist views and more sort of classical computationalist views,
Right.
and it's just remarkable the degree to which it anticipates a lot of later work in connectionism. So it shows you the sort of his breadth and the fertility of his thought. It also points up the extent to which Hayek is a sort of proto-behavioral economist. So one of the things that frustrates me is because I'm
not behavioralist, but behavioral.
Behavioral, yeah.
Right,
so
right,
part of the
sorry.
sensory order was partly an argument against the behaviorism
Yes, exactly.
of the time.
Right.
But by behavioralist or behavioral economics, I just mean the current vogue for sort of empirically fusing psychological experiments with economic theorizing. And Hayek was trying to fuse psychology with economics all along, to such an extent that some of his writing seems like really exotic if you're used to a kind of Gary Becker type, rational choice approach.
Right. I think we may have a slight disagreement, or it may be an apparent disagreement on this. Hayek was he was opposed to, he thought it was wrong, the psychology of his day, which was behaviorism. And so the sensory order was indeed aimed at disputing it. Basically he's saying that what our sensory experience is based on interpretation of our mind. So behaviorism is supposed to try to get rid of all reference to the mind and all reference to interpretation, subjective interpretations, and so this was an attempt to refute that. But he never really joined up his economics so much with his psychology. Now that said, he certainly didn't believe in rational economic man in the way that it became important to the Chicago economists in their models. So that was something that none of the Austrians did. They, acting man was for Mises the basis of all things, but it wasn't. There's none of the stable preferences or any of the other assumptions that you need to make when you're using neoclassical choice theory models, for example.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's I think interesting about Hayek is that his sort of views about cultural selection get so. Actually so radical that it's not clear the extent to which he thinks of the sort of distinctive economic rationality, the sort of the kind of behavior of Homo economicus.
Right.
That he seems to think that both a certain kind of instrumental rationality and a certain kind of epistemic rationality are themselves part of a process of cultural evolution and selection.
That's right. Irrationality is the institutions create the rationality, not the rationality creating the institutions. So that when people, there's some wonderful experiments where they set up the institutions of exchange or trade, whatever some sort of bargaining situation or whatever trading situation, where they have what are called zero intelligence traders. And if you set up the institutions right, fully intelligent people who are engaged in these markets will not differ from zero intelligence traders. So, I mean, the Austrians were always very much, or Hayek in particular, always very big on getting the institutional mix right. Again, this goes back to Doug North's attraction to Hayek, that if you can get the institutions right, then people will behave in ways that are going to accomplish the sorts of things that you would get in models that presume perfect information models, etc. Now there's always that not contradiction, but there's that the difficult part about constructivism. Hayek, some people want to construct institutions in such a way as to get this sort of outcome. And Hayek's evolutionary streak always steered him away from that. And there's a tension there, I think, in his thought, because I mean, he, on the one hand, he would sometimes propose sometimes rather radical institutional change, like he had something called what he called a model constitution in the third book of Law, Legislation, and Liberty. And people say, well, look, if this is this evolution, the guy who's always stressing evolution, how can he be coming up with this kind of constructivist, rationalist proposal? And it's a good question. I think the way that I've tried to resolve it, because I try to figure out how, if Hayek wasn't stupid, so he must there must be something going on here. And the way I think about it is, well, he always wants people to be proposing different alternatives, but it's the evolutionary process that winnows out which ones are going to work. So sometimes when he's talking about evolution, he's talking in very general terms about what's going to happen. And markets might be working wonderfully for a while, and then suddenly the environment changes, and they're really dysfunctional. I mean, this is certainly something that his larger evolutionary theory allows for. And any kind of social organization is as good as it is adapted to the specific environment in which it exists, as you were saying earlier. So
and he's very adamant that he's not saying that because an institution exists, it's off.
Absolutely.
He's not saying that, and that's one of the reasons why he denies being a conservative.
Right.
And partly when you're living in a dynamic world, especially once you've created market institutions that tend to generate a great deal of innovation, that innovation itself tends to have an effect on social structure and preferences, which creates new problems that you need solutions
that you had not intended.
That you had not intended. So there's a reason to try to come up with all sorts of reforms and ideas and new technologies and new policies that are going to deal the best that they can. But you want a lot of. So here I see his point being a little bit like Popper's point about sort of like experimenting with policy.
Yeah.
That you want a lot of variation in attempts to design policy, and then you see what works, and what works gets selected for. Now that kind of selection process isn't dumb, right? It's actually people are intending to select the thing that works. It's not just that it sort of bubbles up and just is selected by history. But there's a lot of that tension in his discussion, but the difference between cosmos and taxis, like an unplanned order and a planned order, because it's very, very difficult to tease them apart.
And every cosmos has organizations within it. Exactly. So
I work at the Cato Institute. The Cato Institute is
an organization.
Is an organization. It's not an unplanned order. It's very planned. It's very managed. Most firms are planned and managed, and so there's an interesting question about the right relationship between intentionally planned endeavors and the way they fit into a larger scheme that literally can't be planned.
Right, and you go back to Menger, and he made the same sort of distinction between pragmatic institutions and then basically what would be spontaneous orders. And the point is, not that both don't exist; they clearly do. That the mistake is when you try to use the methods of an organization on something that is in order. That's when you run into the problems. And Hayek's recurrent theme was the knowledge problem in particular is going to be a difficult one. Organization has a specific set of goals that they're trying to accomplish, and they are trying to figure out what is needed to accomplish the goals. So the knowledge problem is much less important there because you have a specific thing you're trying to reach. You have millions of people with millions of different values and sets of goals that they're all trying to accomplish, and then you try to do that through an organization where you don't have the knowledge of what the individuals want, then you're not going to accomplish it.
Yeah, and it's actually a helpful theory, descriptively and predictively. Hayek together with Coase helps you understand why organizations that get too big tend to fail over time.
Right.
I think we've run out of our time.
Oh, no, really?
I know. I see. I told you it goes so fast. And we didn't talk at all about Hayek's politics, but that's fine. I think people know sort of what Hayek's politics are. I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit about Hayek's defense of a social safety net, which some people seem to think that he's a bad libertarian. Because maybe you want to say 2 minutes about that.
Well, people want to have the kind of consistency in a person's views. They should go to Rothbard. They should go to Mises. Okay, Hayek was his defense of a basic minimum was he would just simply say, a society like ours is sufficiently rich that we can do it, and if I don't view him, and again, this would go back to that kind of evolutionary stuff we were talking about before. He's not somebody who is basing his particular views in natural rights. He's not basing it in some sort of utilitarian calculus. He's not trying to find a foundation for his ethics. He thinks ethics emerge through time as well, through an evolutionary process. And I think he just was asserting that, a society as rich as ours can afford to have some minimum. And where we set the minimum is an interesting question, but that was about as far as he went. That's about as far as I'll go anyway in terms of discussing that. For now, anyway. Perhaps some other time.
All right. Well, I would love to talk to you sometime in the future, Bruce. Thanks so much for coming on. Fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
All of you out there, Bruce's book, which I highly recommend, is Hayek's Challenge: An Intellectual Biography of F.A. Hayek.
Great.
Thanks for coming on, Bruce.
Enjoyed it a lot, Will.
Take care.
Bye.